This week, while American media focused on political theater and trade disputes, a fundamental shift in North American power dynamics crystallized in the boardrooms of Toronto and the mining camps of northern Quebec. The shift was quiet, methodical, and devastating in its implications for American technological supremacy. The catalyst was not a declaration of war or a diplomatic crisis, but rather a series of seemingly routine mining permits, investment announcements, and regulatory frameworks that collectively represent the most significant challenge to American industrial dominance since the rise of Japanese semiconductors in the 1980s. Canada has systematically positioned itself to control the raw materials that power the modern economy, and in doing so, has transformed the fundamental relationship between the two nations. The numbers tell a story that Washington is only beginning to comprehend. Over the past 18 months, Canadian mining operations have secured exclusive supply agreements worth $127 billion with technology companies seeking alternatives to Chinese-controlled mineral processing. Tesla committed $4.6 billion to Canadian lithium processing facilities. General Motors redirected $7 billion in battery production to Quebec. Apple established rare earth element partnerships with Canadian suppliers worth $2.3 billion annually. Each of these agreements represents American capital flowing north to secure access to materials that were once taken for granted. But the true magnitude of this transformation becomes clear when examining the strategic framework behind these individual transactions. This was not the result of market forces or coincidental business decisions. This was the execution of Canada's critical mineral strategy, a comprehensive plan to leverage the country's geological advantages into permanent influence over global technology supply chains. The strategy, formally launched in 2022 but dramatically accelerated in 2024, identified 31 critical minerals essential for renewable energy, defense systems, and advanced electronics. Canada possesses economically viable reserves of 27 of these materials, including some of the world's largest deposits of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements. More importantly, Canada recognized that controlling these materials meant controlling the pace and direction of the global energy transition. The psychological impact on American strategic planners has been profound. For decades, the United States operated under the assumption that Canada would remain a reliable supplier of raw materials, shipping ores south for processing in American facilities and purchase of finished goods at premium prices. The colonial economic model that defined their relationship since World War II suddenly faced systematic dismantlement by a government that understood the difference between being a price taker and a price maker. The first indication of this shift came in early 2024, when Canadian regulators began implementing domestic processing requirements for critical mineral exports. Companies extracting lithium from Quebec's James Bay region would be required to process at least 60% of extracted materials domestically before export. Rare earth mining operations in Saskatchewan faced similar mandates. The message was unmistakable. Canada would no longer serve as a raw material colony for foreign manufacturing industries. American technology companies found themselves confronting a choice they had never anticipated. They could continue sourcing critical minerals from Chinese-controlled suppliers, accepting the geopolitical risks and supply chain vulnerabilities that entailed, or they could partner with Canadian operations, accepting higher costs and Canadian processing requirements in exchange for supply chain security and political stability. The choice became urgent when China began restricting critical mineral exports as part of broader technology competition with the United States. Gallium and germanium export controls in 2023 demonstrated Beijing's willingness to weaponize resource access for geopolitical advantage. American companies suddenly realized that their Chinese suppliers could disappear overnight, leaving American manufacturing dependent on Canadian alternatives that were no longer willing to accept subordinate status. Tesla's response exemplified the new dynamics. Instead of simply purchasing lithium from Canadian suppliers, Tesla committed to building battery manufacturing facilities in Canada, sharing battery technology with Canadian partners, and establishing research partnerships with Canadian universities. The arrangement ensured Tesla's access to critical materials while providing Canada with high-value manufacturing jobs, advanced technology transfer, and control over crucial links in the global electric vehicle supply chain. This represented a fundamental reversal of traditional North American economic patterns. American companies were relocating manufacturing operations to Canada, not because of lower labor costs or regulatory arbitrage, but because Canada controlled access to essential materials and was using that control to capture maximum economic value domestically. The resource colony had become the technological metropole. The Pentagon's response revealed the extent to which this transformation challenged fundamental assumptions about North American security relationships. Defense contractors discovered that Canadian suppliers were essential for producing advanced weapon systems, military electronics, and defense infrastructure. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and General Dynamics found themselves dependent on Canadian critical minerals for products considered essential to American national security. The situation became acute when Canadian regulators began requiring export licenses for dual-use minerals that could serve both civilian and military applications. Rare earth elements needed for precision-guided munitions required explicit Canadian government approval before export to American defense contractors. This gave Canada unprecedented influence over American military production and forced American defense planners to consider Canadian interests when making strategic decisions. Congressional hearings in late 2024 revealed the scope of American vulnerability. Pentagon officials testified that disruption of Canadian critical mineral supplies would severely impact American military readiness within 6 months. Defense contractors warned that alternative suppliers would require years to develop and would cost significantly more than Canadian sources. The committee concluded that American defense capabilities were now partially dependent on Canadian cooperation and Canadian political decisions. The implications extended beyond bilateral relationships to encompass global competition between major powers. China's Belt and Road Initiative had been designed partly to secure access to critical minerals through partnerships with developing nations. Canada's emergence as a strategic mineral controller created an alternative for Western countries seeking to reduce dependence on Chinese-controlled supply chains. European companies began establishing partnerships with Canadian critical mineral suppliers as part of broader efforts to achieve strategic autonomy from both American and Chinese dominance. Canadian nickel and cobalt found eager customers in German automotive companies. Canadian lithium attracted investment from European battery manufacturers. Canadian rare earth elements became essential inputs for European renewable energy systems. This diversification provided Canada with multiple options for its critical mineral exports, reducing dependence on American markets while increasing bargaining power in bilateral negotiations. Canadian suppliers could credibly threaten to redirect exports to European or Asian customers if American companies offered unfavorable terms, or if American politicians attempted to pressure Canada through trade disputes. The financial markets reflected this new reality through dramatic revaluations of Canadian mining companies and resource assets. Canadian lithium producers saw stock prices increase by an average of 230% in 2024 as investors recognized their strategic value. Rare earth mining operations in Quebec and Saskatchewan attracted international investment that valued Canadian deposits at premium prices compared to similar resources in other jurisdictions. More significantly, global capital began flowing toward Canadian critical mineral processing facilities rather than extraction operations alone. Investors understood that controlling mineral processing provided more strategic leverage than controlling raw material extraction, and Canada was building integrated supply chains that captured maximum value domestically while providing essential materials to international customers. The technological implications became clear as Canadian companies began developing proprietary processing technologies that enhanced their competitive advantages. Research partnerships between Canadian universities and mining companies produced innovations in mineral extraction, processing efficiency, and environmental sustainability that positioned Canadian operations as global leaders in critical mineral production. Canadian critical mineral companies established intellectual property portfolios that made international competitors dependent on Canadian technologies and Canadian expertise. This technological leadership complemented Canada's resource advantages by ensuring that even countries with their own critical mineral deposits would require Canadian cooperation to develop economically viable mining operations. The environmental dimension added another layer of complexity to Canada's strategic position. Canadian critical mineral operations operated under environmental regulations that were stricter than most international competitors, providing Canadian suppliers with sustainability credentials that appealed to environmentally conscious technology companies and automotive manufacturers. Companies seeking to meet environmental, social, and governance standards for their supply chains found that Canadian critical mineral suppliers offered compliance with international sustainability standards that competitors in other jurisdictions could not match. This environmental advantage translated into market premiums for Canadian minerals and strengthened Canada's position in negotiations with international customers. The timeline for American adjustment to this new reality became compressed when Canada announced plans for additional domestic processing requirements and export licensing procedures in 2025. American companies realized that the window for securing favorable supply agreements was closing as Canadian suppliers gained confidence in their strategic position and their ability to attract international customers. The scramble for Canadian partnerships intensified throughout 2024, with American technology companies offering increasingly generous terms for access to Canadian critical minerals. Joint ventures replaced simple supplier relationships. Technology sharing agreements became standard components of supply contracts. American companies committed to establishing Canadian operations and hiring Canadian workers as conditions for securing long-term supply agreements. This represented more than a shift in procurement strategies. It represented a fundamental rebalancing of North American economic power, with Canada leveraging its geological advantages to capture technology transfer, manufacturing investment, and strategic influence that had traditionally flowed to American companies and American workers. The broader implications for North American integration became apparent as traditional assumptions about economic dependency were reversed. Instead of Canada depending on American markets for resource exports, American companies increasingly depended on Canadian cooperation for access to materials essential for technological competitiveness and economic growth. The mining camps of northern Quebec and Saskatchewan, long viewed as peripheral to North American economic power, suddenly became strategic assets comparable to Silicon Valley technology clusters or Wall Street financial centers. The communities developing around Canadian critical mineral operations attracted international investment, advanced technology companies, and skilled workers from around the world. The transformation accelerated as other countries recognized Canada's strategic position and sought partnerships that would provide them with alternatives to Chinese mineral processing while reducing dependence on American technology companies. Canadian critical minerals became the foundation for international relationships that bypassed traditional American intermediaries and created new centers of technological cooperation. Canadian universities emerge as global research centers for critical mineral processing, battery technology, and sustainable mining practices. International students and researchers flocked to Canadian institutions that offered access to cutting-edge mineral processing research and partnerships with leading mining companies. The brain drain that had historically moved Canadian talent to American technology companies reversed, as international talent sought opportunities in Canada's expanding critical mineral sector. The strategic patience demonstrated by Canadian policymakers became evident as the full scope of the critical mineral strategy revealed itself. This was not reactive policy designed to respond to immediate circumstances, but rather a comprehensive plan to leverage Canada's geological advantages into permanent influence over global technology supply chains and international economic relationships. The silence with which this transformation proceeded reflected sophisticated understanding of international politics and economic psychology. Rather than announcing ambitious plans or making dramatic statements about challenging American dominance, Canadian officials quietly implemented policies and supported business relationships that systematically repositioned Canada within the global economy. American officials found themselves responding to accomplished facts rather than anticipated threats. By the time Washington recognized the strategic implications of Canada's critical mineral policies, Canadian companies had already secured international partnerships, built processing facilities, and established market relationships that would be difficult to disrupt through political pressure or trade disputes. The leverage equation that had defined Canada-U.S. relations for generations was permanently altered. Canada's control over critical minerals essential for American technological competitiveness provided bargaining power that transcended traditional measures of economic or military strength. American negotiators could no longer assume Canadian compliance with American preferences when Canadian cooperation had become essential for American economic interests. As we examine the implications of this quiet revolution, we must recognize that we are witnessing more than a shift in commodity markets or trade relationships. We are witnessing the emergence of a new form of economic sovereignty based on control of materials essential for modern civilization. Canada has demonstrated that middle powers with strategic resources can reshape international relationships and challenge the assumptions that underpin traditional power structures. The question facing American policymakers is whether they can adapt to partnership with an independent Canada or whether they will attempt to restore the subordinate relationship that served American interests for so long. The answer will determine not only the future of North American economic integration, but also the broader pattern of how technological powers interact with resource controllers in an increasingly complex global economy. The critical minerals buried beneath Canada's northern territories represent more than geological wealth. They represent the raw materials of technological independence and the foundation of a new kind of national power based on controlling what others need, rather than simply providing what others want. The quiet transformation of Canada from resource supplier to strategic resource controller has begun, and its implications will reshape North American power dynamics for generations to come.